Hello, this is Chris Goldthorpe with ChrisChess.com, and this video is for somewhat new players who do not know how to win with a king and a pawn. So we're going to discuss the concept of opposition and of a tempo move and the basics of a king and one pawn versus a king and one pawn. So let's get started. Some of you might be familiar with the ICC, the Internet Chess Club. Makes a nice board that you can use for making a video like this one. And let's clear the board. And let's suppose that we have a king and we have a pawn and black has a king. What we're going to try to do in the end is to have our king, it's as if we are the white pieces, on one of those two squares marked with the blue, because when the king gets to one of those two squares, won't matter which one, he will be controlling all three of the squares that this pawn has yet to walk on, and black will have no opportunity to interfere with the pawn's promotion. So that's our final goal at the end, to get this situation. Or there's another situation that can work. I'm going to change the position here. And we'll get rid of what's on E8 and what's on E5, and then we'll just drag a pawn here and the king here. And in this situation, both people want it to be their opponent's turn to move. So if you are the white pieces and you create this position with your last move, which might have been moving this pawn to the 7th rank without putting black in check, that's going to force black to move his king here. And when he does, then your king will move forward. So just remember, when you move your pawn to the 7th rank without giving check and it's guarded by your king, this is when you have a king and a pawn only against a king only. When you can do this without giving check, make sure your king is to one side, but of course it would be to one side, otherwise where did the pawn come from? The king will be forced to move out of the way, and that lets the white king go here, and he's going to get a queen on the next move. Now if I were to go here and get a queen, how many different legal moves are available to black right now? He can move here, he can move here, but the third option is the one I would expect him to take, and this of course would just be an immediate draw. That's why white can't just promote his pawn right away. He needs to guard f8 here with his king, and that's how he does it. So we want to remember, if the position is like this, we want it to be our opponent's turn to move. If this were white to move, then white would not be able to win. Because if he moves his king here, and there really is nowhere else where he can guard his pawn against the black king. So when he goes here, notice that because pawns don't capture straight ahead, this is a stalemate, and white is not going to win. So that position that we want to see, we want this to happen after our move. If you're the defending king and you just moved your king in front of this pawn, it is now white to move, and you're going to get a draw because he's going to stalemate you or give away the pawn. So there's another position like this. where the kings are on the same file. The attacking king is on the 6th rank. White would seem to have opposition, and if it is black to move, he does indeed have opposition. Now, if white were to move this way to the f8 square, then white could move the pawn up. But unfortunately for white, if it's white's move, then black will get to create this position. So if it's black to move here, it will be black to move with the king at f8 and the pawn at f7. So we both want to create this position also. Let's see the difference if white creates that position. We'll say he's here, and the pawn is here, and the black king is here. Now if white moves the pawn up, he's winning, because he created this position. Whoever created this position may have an opportunity to create this position, meaning they made the last move, meaning they are waiting for their opponent now in Zugzwang to move their king, and then you'll go here and you'll promote your pawn. And hopefully you have already watched some videos on how to win with a king and a queen against a king, because once you get the pawn to turn into a queen, you've now converted the position to king and queen versus king. So there's a few rules to keep in mind about trying to win this. Let's just show you some of them. Obviously, if the pawn is captured, the game is going to be a draw. One way that happens sometimes is you'll have, let's say your king is here off to one side. You've got your pawn there, and the black king is here, and you decide to go this way. The king should never leave these three files. The file that the pawn is in, and one to each side. The king should not be leaving there. But it won't hurt him unless the enemy king can get in between them. This is what I refer to as the rule of 90 degrees. If your king can create a 90-degree angle between himself and the target, your king, even if it is your move, cannot stop his progress in that direction. So white is now powerless to keep his pawn from being captured once black plays that king e4 move. King e4, and the pawn is doomed. It wouldn't matter if the kings were much further down the board. If we were over here like this, and the pawn was still back here. Still, if I go here, black goes here, and because he created this 90-degree angle, we already know there is no way to save this pawn. And of course, king against king is always a draw without exception. So let's look at the next of our rules on there. If the defending king can move to the square immediately in front of the pawn, the game is drawn. If the pawn is moving to the 7th rank without check, that would seem to be an exception. But since we're saying if the defending king can move to the square immediately in front of the pawn, that would mean on his move, the game is drawn. That will always be the case, because as we noted a moment ago, if it is white's turn to move in this situation like this, white's not going to win. If he goes here,
check.
Black puts his king right in front of the pawn on his move. So whenever you see this king and pawn duo here like this, unless it is black to move and he's got the pawn in the 7th rank, unless white made the last move and moved his pawn to the 7th rank without giving check, unless that happened, this is a draw. If the pawn is not yet on the 7th rank, then anytime the king is directly in front of the pawn, we won't even need to know whose move it is to be able to say, yeah, it's a draw. Now, there's a rule similar to that. Let's see, we'll move this pawn and we'll put him here. That pawn also could have been here or here. If the king with the pawn, if the attacking king is on his 6th rank and the pawn is on the 5th rank, guarded by the king, that's why this pawn could have been here or here and everything would be the same. This means that white has a win here. No matter where the black king is, no matter where that black king is, and no matter whose turn it is. If the black king were here now, it would be a mistake to do this, because that would allow black to create this position, and in turn black would create this position with his move, and now white would have the sad option of either stalemating him or giving away the pawn. A draw either way, so that's why moving the pawn there is the wrong move, and this is a very common mistake. This is what you do. You create what is called opposition. This is direct, close, vertical opposition, the kind most easily recognized and the kind most often used. Now, in this whole scenario, excuse me, in this whole scenario, if the kings are far enough apart and the defending king is on move, then the attacker cannot win just because he has an extra pawn. Like, for example, let's set up a situation in Fritz. Fritz's 16 is plenty strong enough, and we'll give black a pawn, and we'll give him his king, of course, and white has only his king, but it'll be white's move. So here we are with white to move. This is not hard to draw. As you watch this video in subsequent viewings, just pay attention to the beginning part more. Right now you're only paying attention to the end part. Yeah, that's not even trying to, that makes it way too easy for the king to come up in front of the pawn. The computer doesn't play very well when it knows it's losing anyway. A human would try to get the king in front of the pawn so that if white were to make an error here, he could still lose. Indeed, if white moved here, it would be easy for black to win, because if he moved here, then black would just go here, and he has opposition. And then this is winning. You can see over here it shows how many moves it takes to win. It's connected apparently to an endgame table base, which you might want to learn about. However, white doesn't have to make that blunder. What he should do is take opposition himself. He can go here. Now he's got opposition. Yeah, opposition. So if black tries to go here to get in front of his pawn, white goes here with close direct vertical opposition, and because the king can never get to any of these three squares, the key squares for this black pawn, black will not be able to win. If he moves the king, white just keeps his king as far forward as he can and on the same file as the black king. If black does not want to repeat the position, his only alternative would be to move his pawn. Anytime the king and pawn are side by side on their 5th rank or anywhere further back. Now for black, this is only his 3rd rank, but they could be as far forward as, say, d4 and e4, and if white here, the defender, could get 2 squares in front of either one, he still has a draw. Now if we got this position all the way down so that the white king were on d1, then clearly if it were white to move, white would be losing. But he doesn't have to do that. He follows a very simple formula. If he must move straight back, if he must move backward, he should move straight back. Otherwise, he should try to keep his king as close to the pawn as possible, or the square directly in front of the pawn. Never let the king in front of the pawn. So white simply goes here. If the king goes over here, we'll attack it. He guards it. A silly mistake would be to go here when black would just go here with an easy win. But white doesn't have to make such a silly move. Once again, if he's going to go backwards, go straight back. If the king comes up, we take opposition with the king. Anytime the pawn moves, if we can't capture it, we go to the square directly in front of it. If we can't do that, then we'll be 2 squares in front of it. If black goes here, white must move backward. If he must move backward, go straight back. Whatever side the king comes to, we go to the same side. It looks as though black keeps making the king back up, and indeed he does. But this is critical because black cannot take opposition because his own pawn is in the way. He goes here, and now white takes opposition. Moving the pawn to the 7th rank, giving check, doesn't work. Anytime the defending king can move to the square immediately in front of the pawn, on his move he has a draw, and indeed now it is drawn, as black must stalemate him or give up the pawn. So what did we just see here? We saw that if it were white to move here, or we can simply say if it were the defending king's move, the defender can stop the win when they're this far apart because he has enough time to get close to the pawn. If it is black to move here, white has no chance and cannot save himself. So let's make sure we know what key squares are and what opposition are. If you take the entire chessboard and divide it into 4 big quadrants, and then take each quadrant and cut it through the middle horizontally and vertical to make each quadrant into 4 quadrants of 4 squares each, then we can think of them as type A squares, like upper left, or type B squares, upper right, type C squares in the lower left, type D squares in the lower right of any of these groups of 4 here. That's A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. So if you want to take opposition, you simply move your king to a square that would be like the same letter. What letter is this? Well, we recognize it's in this quadrant of the board, so when we do this visually, we see that he's in an A square. For me to be in an A square, I would have to move my king up to A2. I can't move to C2, A4, or C4 from here, or some of the other squares where I would take opposition, but I could move to A2. If you're moving your king to the same rank or file as your opponent's king, then you only need to move to the same color of square to have opposition. If the kings are not on the same rank or file, then the way you can know that you can make opposition would be right after your move, Let's see. We'll put a king here and a black king here, and we'll give him a pawn. Okay, for white to take opposition here, since he can't get to the same rank or file, he's going to get to a square that if a rook could go to either king, it would be on the same color square as both kings. So if I went here, notice that a rook on b6 would be looking both at f6 and b4. A rook at f4 would be looking at rook at f4 would be looking at f6 and also at b4. So since all four corners of the smallest rectangle that would go around both kings, if all four corners are the same color, then after your move, that means you have taken opposition. Now, if I had moved here, would that work? No, because that's a white square and that's a white square, but that one did work. Okay, so now we know what opposition is. Let's see if we can see what key squares are. Key squares, okay. Here we have a pawn on the 3rd rank. So his key squares will be on the 5th rank, because if the pawn moved 2 times, that would be the rank he would be on. The square in the same file as the pawn and one to either side form what we call key squares. The importance of that: if you put your king onto a key square, then unless your opponent can immediately capture your pawn right after that, you're winning. So put your king on a key square. If he can't take your pawn, you win. This king is nowhere near this pawn. So it's just a matter of, can this king pass through to one of these squares before black could stop him? Well, in 2 moves I could be here. If I move first, he could be only here or here, but his second move could be to here, even if I were here. That would allow me to go here, but then he would go here. So trying to get my king alone to the key square here wouldn't quite work. Also, the king is within the square here. See, the pawn can just run if he can get to the promotion square before the black king can capture it. So here we are trying to win with the king and pawn against a king. Let's see what it looks like from the beginning. And of course black would have to be all the way back here, and we won't expect the computer to make any thoroughly silly moves, although the computer seems, when it's losing, to make moves that don't make sense. Okay, black has opposition because it's white's move, but we can see what the importance of key squares are, because I can now use my tempo move. I can move the pawn without disturbing the relative position of the kings and force black to make his decision first. Now, because it's his move, I have opposition. Whichever way he moves to the side, I will go forwards. Okay, and there's no particular sense in him moving further from the path of the pawn, but of course it makes no difference at this point. I could go here, but then he would go here. See, so if I go here, not a good move. He goes here, and he's ready to go here and take the pawns. So it's better for me to go here. Notice, ding, ding, I have 5 and 6. With the king on 6, guarding the pawn on the 5th rank, we already know this is a forced win for the player with the extra pawn. No human would ever make that move. If you're a human trying to stop another human from winning, you would go in front of the pawn. Now white takes opposition here, and black must step to one side or the other, allowing me to go forward. And black already knows I'm going to get a queen, so he might as well start moving his king toward the center as much as he can. I get a queen. And I'll try to surround him. Notice black only has one legal move here. See, we don't force him to the edge of the board by putting him in check over and over. We force him to the edge of the board by simply taking up the slack and taking control of any squares where he could head back toward the center, and then we just wait. Black must go to the edge. If he goes here, white has 2 ways of making a checkmate in one move. Right here on this move, white can checkmate black. 2 different correct answers. So he goes here, and now white has a way to make a checkmate in 2 moves with a white move. He goes here. And of course black has to make a black move because he can. And then this is checkmate. This is also checkmate. Okay. For now, we're just concerned with getting to the point where the pawn promotes, because there's a separate video on how to win once you get the queen. But the important thing is keep your king in front of your pawn. And you need to get your king to the 7th rank, to the file right beside your pawn. Never let the enemy king between your king and your pawn, and then the pawn can promote. Now, if the pawn is close to the end of the board, we don't need the king here. See, you simply make a diagonal line to the back row and then come backward to the same rank as the pawn. And we've created a little square here. We call this the box, and the rule is simple. If the king is not in the box, the pawn runs in, becomes a queen. It's that simple, as it would be here. Even if the pawn were here, the black king is not in the box. In fact, if the pawn were here, as long as it's white's move, white's going to win. If it were black to move, he could move to e8 and step into the box. Here, the black king would have to get to c8 to be in this box. And then a rook pawn would be difficult to win with, often impossible. But that's how you draw the square. Let's look at a different pawn position. Let's say the pawn was here instead. Now, if the king's on this side, we're concerned with this box here. Black would have to be in this box already to stop the pawn. Or if the king was on this side, he could be anywhere in this group of 9 squares, and then he would be able to catch the pawn by the time it gets here. But if the black king were instead on a different square where he wasn't near there, anywhere behind the pawn, and of course the pawn will queen. So you only use the king if you need to. So your first goal is to get that pawn to the end and turn it into a queen. A king and a pawn against a king is not an automatic win, especially if the black king is both within the square of the pawn and fewer moves from the pawn. If he's 2 or more moves closer to the pawn than you are, and he's within the square of the pawn, he's just going to run over and capture the pawn, and there's nothing you can do about it. But often when you have the pawn, you can win. You should get to the point where you can recognize how to win at any given moment, or recognize any position where a king and a pawn against a king is a win. What I mean by recognize at any given moment is anywhere within the process of making the checkmate, you should know where you're at. There's a few typical mistakes made most often, so I just want to... Here, if you don't start moving your king forward immediately, you're not going to win. So you've got to make one of these 2 moves. Now, once again, if white moves his pawn, it's already too late for him to win. If he moves the pawn right now, won't work. White has got to move the king. Let's say he goes here, and maybe he goes here, goes here. See, that's a mistake that white just made. He put these side by side. Now black goes here and he has a draw. Not a good move. Let's go back and say that this happened. Or, yeah, let's I'm trying to get to a position where there's a certain mistake that is frequently made. Well, we know that putting them side by side does not work. But let's say that this only went to here and he went here. And well, here, if you move the pawn up, you have ruined it. Side by side does not work. Here's another case where it comes up frequently. It goes like this, and let's say he goes here, I go here, and he goes here. A tempting move to make is to do this. It looks like your king's better over here. However, once you go here, black only has one correct move. He must go here. But if he goes there, he has a draw. Now if white moves this pawn forward, this move would lose, because white would go king f6 right away. He's got to go straight back. If he goes to f6, white is the one who creates this position. And of course, then he can create this position. Black is forced to allow the king to go here after this move and this move. And now we see white is going to get the queen, which would send us on to the video on how to win with a king and a queen against a king. Okay, so this should be all you need to know to win with a king and a pawn against a king when it is a win for you. Thanks for watching. Again, this is Chris Goldthorpe with ChrisChess.com.